Hello again, and we are going to start talking about personality disorders. Personality disorders, how do we distinguish between personality traits and a personality disorder? Well, let's define personality first. And personality is going to be its patterns of thinking and its patterns of behavior that remains relatively stable over time, right? Most of us, we change a little bit here and there, but our personalities remain largely stable throughout the life course. We're going to contrast this with a personality disorder, which is characterized by rigid thinking and reactive behaviors that result in difficulties in adaptation to the environment. So these individuals have a very difficult time managing and maintaining relationships of any kind. The etiology of personality disorders is very difficult to pinpoint. We do see that there's like a heritability trait, that there may be a genetic component to this. And we also see that there is common histories of abuse or trauma among people with personality disorders in general. Personality disorders are organized into one of three clusters. There's the odd cluster, and there's dramatic, and there's anxious. So let's start with the odd cluster. And the odd cluster, we are going to start with schizoid personality disorder. These individuals experience no pleasure in interpersonal relationships, and they avoid engagement with other human beings. They prefer to engage in solitary activities, and they frequently display little emotion. They appear to be cold, detached, and indifferent. Very little, if anything at all, will produce a happiness response. First responders of all kinds, especially police officers, are likely to engage with members of the homeless community, in which we tend to see a higher than usual proportion of schizoid personality disorders. That literally, no matter how much help you offer them, resources you offer them, they just prefer to be alone. I want to talk to you. I like living over here in the outdoors by myself, doing my own thing. They're just not interested in engaging with humans. Treatment for this disorder is the teaching of social skills and trying to increase the number of social interactions that this individual partakes in. This can be really difficult because they really don't have an interest in enhancing their social skills, right? They don't have any incentive to do so, and they don't want to. So it's very difficult to treat. And what I will say is that generally personality disorders in general are very, very difficult to treat overall. They tend to be static traits, meaning that, yes, we have some therapies, some we treat with medications, but it tends to be present for the life course. It's very hard to treat. The next is schizotypal personality disorder, and this is going to be very similar to schizoid personality disorder. Schizotypal has, like schizoid, very little interest in social engagement, few emotional experiences or delays, a lack of happiness, just like your schizoid PD. I say PD, it's just reference personality disorder, by the way. However, schizotypal can be distinguished from schizoid because this antisocialness, this isolation is also coupled with strange behaviors. So strange thinking, strange behaviors, often what is referred to as magical thinking, right? It's not full-blown schizophrenia, but I will say it gets close. It flirts with a schizophrenic diagnosis. Schizotypal PDs will often hear people talking or laughing or a car randomly honking in the distance, and they perceive it as all related to them, that they're laughing at me. What did you say to me? And like, that car down the street was honking at me, right? So this magical thinking, that they also tend to believe that they're mind readers or that they have powers, that they can control other people, etc. And that's how we distinguish schizotypal personality disorder from schizoid. You can also recognize them by the way that they're dressed. They often tend to dress really mismanaged, really strangely, excessive makeup, like really excessive makeup. Their dress is just generally odd. They utilize strange language and paranoia, especially when engaged by or interviewed by first responders, because they, have that magical thinking. They think that, maybe you're part of a government conspiracy to overtake me, right? So first responders who do engage with them have a little bit of a challenge on their hands. Next is paranoid personality disorder. First responders are likely to be called to the residence of somebody who is complaining, of somebody with paranoid personality disorder. They'll be complaining that their, neighbor is malicious and always planning to kill them, and that we're trying to psychologically terrorize them with their loud music. That they truly believe everyone is around the corner trying to cause them harm, cause them death, cause them discomfort of some kind. You may not recognize this one right away because it's not always saying something wild like they're trying to kill me, right? It may be, you're called to a domestic violence incident where, he keeps, he's physically violent with his wife or girlfriend because she's cheating on me. I know she's cheating on me. Well, okay, I mean, you still can't hit people or whatever, but how do you know she's cheating on you? I just know. I know. There's no proof. I mean, she's never gone, right? I check her phone all the time. I haven't found any proof, but I know it, right? That's the paranoid personality disorder. They never have any evidence to support their claims, right? But these, again, could be your frequent flyers calling about the neighbor next door that's trying to kill them all the time. They're constantly suspicious and distrustful of people. They have this misperception that everybody wants to harm them, even though no one really cares or even knows who they are. They are constantly evaluating their environment for signs of, like traps and poison and so forth. Others intending to harm them. And they're often openly hostile, tend to be very self-righteous, and they will find evidence that supports their paranoia, even in the most neutral circumstances where there's nothing there, right? They can become aggressive in defense of themselves when they think they're trying to stave off a predator, and they can rely on calls, superfluous calls to law enforcement to fend off perceived attacks. So this is definitely something that, if you're ever in response to a call and this person just keeps on calling and there's no evidence of anything they're saying, I mean, this is definitely when you want to think about paranoid personality disorder. Let's move on to the dramatic cluster. And in the dramatic cluster, we're going to start with what is called histrionic personality disorder. And these are people who suffer from this have very superficial emotions. They're constantly changing, and they express everything in a super dramatic, over the top capacity. They appear very inauthentic because they are, right? And the primary motivation behind the dramatic displays of everything is to garner attention, right? They desperately hunger for the attention of others. And interestingly enough, once they obtain the attention of others, they will often get bored with that person and move on very quickly to a new challenge and, behaving these grandiose, over the top, dramatic capacities until they obtain that attention and then move on. This occurs most notably in women, notably more than men. And their entire existence is about attention, from the way they dress to the way they speak to the amount of makeup that they wear. They can be very seductive in approach because it garners attention. But relationships are often short-lived. They bore easily and they move on quickly. When they are not given the attention that they so, thirstily want, they're prone to tantrums and angry outbursts, which is where first responders can come in, right? That they really can. There can be some circumstances where people need to be separated. Psychotherapy is utilized to help obtain some self-evaluation that, your behavior is manipulative, that's not okay, your behavior is socially inappropriate, but again, it's a personality disorder, it's very hard to overcome. Next is going to be narcissistic personality disorder. And those with narcissistic PD believe themselves to be special relative to everybody else. That there's something about me, I'm better, I'm smarter, I'm more capable, the rest of you are idiots, right? That they have very grandiose self-perception. And they demand admiration and they demand respect from people. And it also comes with a very strong sense of entitlement to other people's attention, to their time, to their resources. They're very arrogant. They lack empathy. They have no problem exploiting other people. They want to be treated different and better than everybody else, even though there's no reason for that whatsoever. Because the rules, according to them, the rules don't apply to them. When their emotional demands are not met, they will often respond in angry, aggressive, explosive outbursts. which can certainly garner first responder attention, which is frequently followed by deep bouts of depression because that grandiosity isn't being reflected in the people that they're engaging with. These individuals see other people as simple vessels that can fulfill their need for excessive admiration, and it leads all of their relationships to be really hollow and very devoid of any real substance. Very few narcissistic personality disorders seek therapy because they believe there's nothing wrong with them. It's everybody else who has the problem. And a first responder is most likely, it's not uncommon for first responders to, possibly work with some narcissistic personality disorders who are high in the hierarchy, right? People who are in the workplace, at chief, somebody in a position of authority who needs that constant affirmation, that constant worship, who knows better than everybody else and is never open to any sort of, input from anybody else because you're not me, right? Moving on to borderline personality disorder. This is another personality disorder and mental illness that is more common in women than it is in men. These individuals are characterized by extreme instability and turmoil in their relationships. They have a habit of idealizing and worshiping the people that come into their lives and building them up, and so important to me. But when a person puts down a boundary or doesn't do what they want, that idolization just comes crumbling down and turns into immediate, I despise you, I hate you, look what you've done. They go very quickly from worship love to hate and rejection. They can only see people as good and bad. They can't see anything in between, any gray area. And there's a strong fear of abandonment. And that's where that sort of that idolizing and the hating comes in. That like, I don't want you to leave me. I love you. You're the best. You're so important. But the minute you don't do what I want, you're abandoning me, and they get very upset. There's an inability to respect boundaries, right? So this could be situations where, you've got the female stalker because she won't respect boundaries and, she idolizes you and by God, it's going to work out, right? They are prone to threatening suicide. They're prone to attempting suicide. They're prone to engaging in self-harm when they don't get the reaction that they want. So certainly first responders are going to run into that at some point. It's not uncommon for people with borderline personality disorder to be job hoppers, right? They don't hold a single job for long. They get very intense but short-lived interest in hobbies, like they're all in and then they're just done and they move on. And they tend to be very expressive in their style of dress. Again, therapy is often ineffective because there's that pendulum swinging. So even when they sit down with a therapist, at first they're going to idolize the therapist, but when the therapist tells them something they don't want to hear, then they're going to hate and despise the therapist and quit therapy. So it's really hard to treat borderline personality disorders with any level of success. Next, we're going to move on to antisocial personality disorder, which you probably alternatively know as psychopathy. Antisocial personality disorder is characterized by extremely manipulative behaviors, suspicious behavior, paranoia behavior, narcissistic behavior. They're very impulsive. And aggression, they often engage in aggression, but what really defines them more than anything else, although that's certainly a heck of a list, is that they have no, what we would call conscience, right? They have no ability to feel guilt. They have no ability to feel remorse, sympathy, empathy. They literally, it's not inside of them, right? And there's a lot of theories as to why that is, and we'll talk about those shortly. Law enforcement in particular is going to come into contact with a lot of antisocial PD. In fact, the presence in the prison population of antisocial personality disorders is quite large. It's quite large. In the general population, not so much, but there is a concentration of people with this personality disorder in prison. And it's because of all of those symptoms, right? That they engage in crime, they engage in violence. They don't have the boundaries that things like sympathy and empathy keep the rest of us from engaging in certain activities. Their decision making is super impulsive. They have a very, very hard time controlling impulse, so that the minute it enters their mind, boom, it becomes a behavior. There's no, cost benefit of like, is this a good idea? What are the consequences? Nope, it's just boom, impulse. which tends to get them into trouble a lot. And it also tends to result in them harming a lot of people in a lot of different ways, whether it's physically, emotionally, economically, etc. They have no sense of remorse, responsibility, or accountability. So all of that is fair game, right? There's no internal triggers that stop behavior, which is why they come into contact with law enforcement so frequently. They understand that they're different from everybody else. They tend to be very intelligent, and they also understand that if presented in their natural capacity, they would not be accepted. They would not have success with people. So they learn to mimic other people's emotional reactions. So they can appear as incredibly charming, right? Incredibly charming, good talkers, right? But it's skin deep. It's very skin deep, and it's literally a means to an end. So they copy regular behaviors. Certainly every serial killer you've ever heard falls under this diagnosis, but this isn't limited to serial killers. That's a big misconception that in order to be a psychopath, you have to be violent. That is not true. There are many nonviolent psychopaths out there. In fact, there's research that theorizes that, there's an overabundance of psychopaths who are CEOs, who are financial analysts, because they engage in this high risk taking behavior with absolutely no consequence. And that's how they end up in those positions, because it literally, it's not, most of us would be like, oh, God, I can't make this person's $1 million trade. What if I lose their money to an antisocial PD? And they don't care. It has no impact on them whatsoever. So they take those risks, right? There's a strong heritability trait here. Okay. So there is the concept that a psychopath can be born and can start demonstrating behaviors as early as 3. However, what research has told us over time is that there's 2 factors at play here, and both of them take place in the frontal lobes in the brain that simply don't function like everybody else's frontal lobes. This can happen with people who have brain damage or traumatic brain injury to the frontal lobes, where they were once upon a time a completely and totally normal person with a range of emotions, and they get into a car accident and they have permanent damage to their frontal lobes, and it's like a switch was turned and their personality is wildly different and negative and emotionless and remorseless and aggressive. In the individuals that just seem to manifest antisocial personality disorder without head trauma, we also see that there are exceptionally slow brain waves relative to the normal population, and that there is a deficit of electrical function in their frontal lobes, which speaks to something organic, that there's something legitimately physically different about this group of people, and that's probably why they can't experience these emotions that regulate their behavior. Right. Therapy is largely useless because they just don't care. Like, they don't care about having relationships. They don't care about being a good person or what have you. And they just, they live for themselves completely. So that explains the high incidence of their involvement with the police. Next is going to be the anxious cluster, and we're going to start with dependent personality disorder. Those with dependent PD often look to others to take care of them. They avoid independence and self-reliance at all costs. They are characterized by feelings of helplessness, fear of abandonment, fear of having to take care of themselves. They're very submissive people, but they're also very manipulative in that they will, create an environment in which somebody is forced to take care of them because they don't want to take care of themselves. They often don't learn regular skills like driving or cooking or laundry or anything like that, because that would require self-reliance and independence. Their greatest fear is abandonment, and often what ends up happening is that the caretaker eventually snaps of the manipulative circumstances of the constant caretaking, and they're met with rejection from the caregiver. And this is usually where first responders come in, when that caregiver is unable to leave the relationship, or when the relationship becomes explosive or violent because of the manipulation and the inability to leave the relationship. In addition, your dependent PDs might be, again, those frequent flyers who are constantly calling 911, asking for police or EMS or firefighters to accomplish tasks that they don't want to accomplish on their own, which is certainly inappropriate because it wastes time, it wastes resources and manpower, and it takes away first responders from those who actually need them. Next is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Okay, this is very similar to the mental illness we already talked about, obsessive compulsive disorder. These individuals are so intensely focused on order and organization and the minutia of life that it interferes with their ability to function at all, and they can't engage in daily tasks. They can't hold jobs. They can't have relationships. They demand perfection of themselves, and they demand perfection of everybody around them. And when they have a hard time delegating tasks because only I can do it right. You guys can't do it right. So they're very stubborn. It makes them very difficult to cohabit with. It makes them very difficult to work with. And certainly there's a lot of potential for domestic disturbances there. Finally, we're going to talk about avoidant personality disorder. These individuals are deeply insecure. They're very fearful of conflict. They avoid engaging with people, talking to people out of fear of shame or embarrassment, that they're going to say something stupid or they're going to embarrass themselves and they can't handle that publicly. They're unlikely to come into contact with first responders because they want to sidestep social interactions of all kinds. They don't want to seek them out, right? They believe they're inferior, they believe they're inept or inadequate in some capacity, which drives their need to avoid people.